9. Hic labor ille domus et inextricabilis error. Virgil. Laboriosus exitus domus. Ascensius. Laboriosa ad entrandum. Nicholas Trevet. Note X. Here is the toil of that house, and the inextricable wandering. Aeneid 6.27. The house, difficult of exit. Ascensius, Paris 1501. Difficult to enter. Trevet, Basel 1490. Note 135. At least, as Daniel Hortz lamented, by granting all involved the right to wander, e.g., daydream, free associate, fantasize, seek, etc., etc. See Gaston Bachelard. That which is discursive will inevitably reappropriate the heterogeneity of the disparate, and thus, with such an unanticipated and unreconciled gesture, bring about a reassessment of self. Struck through text. Or in other words, like the house, the film itself captures us and prohibits us at the same time as it frees us to wonder, and so first misleads us, inevitably, drawing us from the us, thus only in the end to lead us, necessarily, for where else could we have really gone, back again to the us, and hence back to ourselves. End struck through text. See Daniel Hortz's Understanding the Self, The Maze of You, Boston, Garden Press, 1995, page 261. Note 129. Strictly as an aside, Jacques Derrida once made a few remarks on the question of structure and centrality. It is too complex to adequately address here. For some, however, this mention alone may prove useful when considering the meaning of play, origins, and ends, especially when applied to the Navidson house. Ce centre avait pour fonction non seulement d'orienter et d'équilibrer, d'organiser la structure. On ne peut en effet penser une structure inorganisée, mais de faire surtout que le principe d'organisation de la structure limite ce que nous pourrions appeler le jeu. Note 137. Labby is also probably cognate with sleep. Note 134. Penelope Reed Doob, The Idea of the Labyrinth, from Classical Antiquity through the Middle Ages, Ithaca, Cornell University Press, 1990, page 1, note X. Here the text returns to note X. A continuation of note 129. De la structure. Sans doute le centre d'une structure, en orientant et en organisant la cohérence du système, permet-il le jeu des éléments à l'intérieur de la forme totale. Et aujourd'hui encore, une structure privée de tout centre représente l'impensable lui-même. And later on, c'est pourquoi, pour une pensée classique de la structure, le centre peut être dit paradoxalement dans la structure et hors de la structure. Il est au centre de la totalité et pourtant, puisque le centre ne lui appartient pas, la totalité a son centre ailleurs. Le centre n'est pas le centre. Note 130. Here's the English, the best I can do. The function of a center was not only to orient, balance, and organize the structure. One cannot, in fact, conceive of an unorganized structure, but above all to make sure that the organizing principle of the structure would limit what we might call the play of the structure. By orienting and organizing the coherence of the system, the center of a structure permits the play of its elements inside the total form. And even today, the notion of a structure lacking any center represents the unthinkable itself. And later on, This is why classical thought concerning structure could say that the center is, paradoxically, within the structure and outside it. The center is at the center of the totality, and yet, since the center does not belong to the totality, is not part of the totality has its center elsewhere. The center is not the center. Note 131. Conversely, Christian Norberg Schultz writes, in terms of spontaneous perception, man's space is subjectively centered. The development of schemata, however, does not only mean that the notion of center is established as a means of general organization, but that certain centers are externalized as points of reference in the environment. This need is so strong that man, since remote times, has thought of the whole world as being centralized. In many legends, the center of the world is concretized as a tree or a pillar, symbolizing a vertical axis mundi. Mountains were also looked upon as points where sky and earth meet. The ancient Greeks placed the navel of the word, omphalos, in Delphi, while the Romans considered their capital as Caput Mundi. For Islam, Kaaba is still the center of the world. Eliade points out that in most beliefs it is difficult to reach the center. It is an ideal goal, which one can only attain after a hard journey. To reach the center is to achieve a consecration and initiation. To the profane and illusory existence of yesterday, there succeeds a new existence, real, lasting, and powerful. But Eliade points out that every life, even the least eventful, can be taken as the journey through a labyrinth. Note 132. What Derrida and Norberg Schultz neglect to consider is the ordering will of gravitation, or how between any two particles of matter exists an attractive force. This relationship, usually represented as g, with a value of 6.670 times 10 to the negative 11 newtons meters squared over kilograms squared. Gravity, as opposed to gravitation, applies specifically to the Earth's effect on other bodies and has had as much to say about humanity's sense of center as Derrida and Norberg Schultz. Gravity informs words like balance, above, below, and even rest. Thanks to the slight waver of endolymph on the ampullary crest in the semicircular duct or in the rise and fall of cilia or maculae in the utricle or saccule, gravity speaks a language comprehensible long before the words describing it are ever spoken or learned. Albert Einstein's work on this matter is also worth studying, though it is important not to forget how Navidson's house ultimately confounds even the labyrinth of the inner ear. Note 133. This gets at a Liszewski and Escher theme, which Zampano seems to constantly suggest without ever really bringing right out into the open. At least that's how it strikes me. Pages 30, 356, and 441, however, kind of contradict this, though not really. End note 133. Return to note 130. Something like that. From Jacques Derrida's Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, in Writing and Difference, translated by Alan Bass, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1978, pages 278 to 9. End note 130. Return to note X. See H.J. Thompson's Fragments of Ancient Scholia on Virgil Preserved in Latin Glossaries in W.M. Lindsay and H.J. Thompson's Ancient Lore in Medieval Latin Glossaries, London, St. Andrews University Publications, 1921. End note X. Note 120. In fact, all of this was quoted directly from Penelope Reed Dubs' The Idea of the Labyrinth, from Classical Antiquity through the Middle Ages, Ithaca, Cornell University Press, 1990, pages 21, 97, 145, and 227. A perfect example of how Zampano likes to obscure the secondary sources he's using in order to appear more versed in primary documents. Actually, a woman by the name of Tatiana turned me onto that bit of info. She'd been one of Zampano's scribes and, lucky for me, she told me over the phone, still had, among other things, some of the old book lists he'd requested from the library. I do have to say, though, getting over to her place was no easy accomplishment. I had trouble just walking out my door. Things are definitely deteriorating. Even reaching for the latch made me feel sick to my stomach. I also experienced this awful tightening across my chest, my temples instantly registering a rise in pulse rate. And that's not the half of it. Unfortunately, I don't think I can do justice to how truly strange this all is. A paradox of sorts. Since, on one hand, I'm laughing at myself, mocking the irrational nature of my anxiety, what I continue, in fact, to perceive as a complete absurdity. I mean, Johnny, what do you really have to be afraid of? While, on the other hand, and at the same time, mind you, finding myself absolutely terrified, if not of something in particular, there were no particulars as far as I could see, then of the reaction itself, as undeniable and unimpeachable as Zampano's black trunk. I know it makes no sense, but there you have it. What should have negated the other only seemed to amplify it instead. Fortunately, or not fortunate at all, Thumper's advice continued to echo in my head. I accepted the risk of cardiac arrest, muttered a flurry of fucks, and charged out into the day, determined to meet Tatiana and retrieve the material. Of course, I was fine. Except as I started walking down the sidewalk, I watched a truck veer from its lane, flatten a stop sign, desperately try to slow, momentarily redirect itself, and then, in spite of all the brakes on that monster, all the accompanying smoke and ear-puncturing shrieks, it still barreled straight into me. Suddenly I understood what it meant to be weightless, flying through the air, no longer ruled by that happy dyad of gravity and mass, until I was, landing on the roof of a parked car, which turned out to be my car, a good 15 feet away, hearing the thud but not actually feeling it. I even momentarily blacked out, but came to just in time to watch the truck still hurtling towards me until it was actually slamming into me, causing me to think, and you're not going to believe this, I can't believe this asshole just totaled my fucking car. Of all the cars on this street, and he had to fucking trash mine. Even as all that steel was grinding into me, instantly pulverizing my legs, my pelvis, the metal from the grill wedging forward like kitchen knives, severing me from the waist down. People started screaming, though not about me. Something to do with the truck. It was leaking all over the place. Gas. It had caught fire. I was going to burn. Except it wasn't gas. It was milk. Only there was no milk. There was no gas, no leak either. There weren't even any people. Certainly none who were screaming, and there sure as hell wasn't any truck. I was alone. My street was empty. A tree fell on me, so heavy it took a crane to lift it. Not even a crane could lift it. There are no trees on my block. This has got to stop. I have to go. I did go. When I reached Tatiana's place, she'd just gotten back from the gym, and her brown legs glistened with sweat. She wore black spandex shorts and a pink athletic halter top, which was very tight, but still could not conceal the ample sides of her breasts. I said hello, and then explained again how I had come into possession of the old man's papers, and why, in my effort to straighten them all out, I needed to trace some of his references. She happily handed over the reading lists she'd compiled on his behalf, and even dug up a few notes she'd made relating to the etymology of labor. When she offered me a drink, I jokingly suggested a Jack and Coke. I guess she didn't understand my sense of humor, or understand it perfectly. She appeared with the drink and poured herself one as well. We spoke for another hour, ended up finishing all the Jack, and then right out of the blue she said, "I won't let you fuck me." Time to get going, I thought, and began to stand up. Not that I'd expect anything, mind you, but if you want, you can come on me, she added. I sat back down, and before I could think of something to say, she had tugged off her top and stretched herself out in the middle of the floor. Her tits were round, hard, and perfectly fake. As I straddled her, she unbuttoned my pants. Then she reached for some extremely aromatic oil sitting on her coffee table. She squeezed hard enough to release a thin stream. It dripped off of me, a warm rain spilling down over her toned belly and large brown nipples. Pleased with what she'd done, she settled back to watch me stroke and grind myself into my own hands. At one point, she bit down on her lower lip, and it amped me up even more. When she started to caress her own breasts, small groans of pleasure rising up from her throat, I felt the cum in my balls begin to boil. However, only when I got ready to climax did I lose sight of her, my eyes slamming shut, something I believe now she'd been waiting for, a temporary instant of darkness, where vulnerable and blind to everything but my own pleasure, she could reach up beneath me and press the tip of an oil-soaked finger against my asshole, circling, rubbing, until finally she pushed hard enough to exceed the threshold of resistance, slipping inside me and knowing exactly where to go, too, heading straight for the prostate, the P-spot, the loud button on this pumping, stereophonic fuck system I never knew I had, initiating an almost unbearable scream for and of pleasure. Endorphins spitting through my brain at an unheard-of rate as muscles in my groin almost painfully contracted in a handful of heart-stomping spasms, not something I could say I was exactly prepared for. I exploded, a stream of white flying across her tits, strings of the stuff dripping off her nipples, collecting in pools around her neck, some of it leading as far as her face, one gob of it on her chin, another on her lower lip. She smiled, started to gently rub my semen into her black skin, and then opened her mouth as if to sigh. Only she didn't sigh. No sound, not even a breath, just her moon-bright teeth, and finally her tongue licking first her upper lip before turning to her lower lip where, smiling, her eyes focused on mine, watching me, watching her. She licked up and finally swallowed my cum. Note mirrored right angles. So sorry. Note 121. German for building plan. Editors. End note 121. End note 120. K. Having already discussed in Chapter 5 how echoes serve as an effective means to evaluate physical, emotional, and thematic distances present in the Navidson record, it is now necessary to remark upon their descriptive limitations. In essence, echoes are confined to large spaces. However, in order to consider how distances within the Navidson house are radically distorted, we must address the more complex ideation of convolution, interference, confusion, and even decentric ideas of design and construction, in other words, the concept of a labyrinth. It would be fantastic if, based on footage from the Navidson record, someone were able to reconstruct a bow plan, note, mirrored right angles, for the house. Of course, this is an impossibility, not only due to the wall shifts, but also the film's constant destruction of continuity, frequent jump cuts prohibiting any sort of accurate map-making. Consequently, in lieu of a schematic, the film offers instead a schismatic rendering of empty rooms, long hallways, and dead ends, perpetually promising but forever eluding the finality of an immutable layout. Curiously enough, if we can look to history to provide us with some context, the reasons for building labyrinths have varied substantially over the ages. Note 122. For further insight into mazes, consider Paolo Santarcangeli's Livre des Labyrinths, Russ Krame's The Surviving Web in Daedalus, summer 1995, Herman Kern's Labyrinthi, W.H. Matthews' Mazes and Labyrinths, Stella Pinnaker's Double Axe, Rodney Castleton's The Knossos Labyrinth, Harold Sieber's Inadequate Thread, W.W.R. Ball's Mathematical Recreations and Essays, Robertson Farrell Smith's Complex Knots, No Simple Solutions, O.B. Hardison Jr.'s Entering the Maze, and Patricia Flynn's Jejunum and Ilium. End note 122. For example, the English hedgerow maze at Longleat was designed to amuse garden party attendants, while Amenemhet III of the 12th dynasty in Egypt built for his mortuary temple a labyrinth near Lake Moeris to protect his soul. Struck through text. Most famous of all, however, was the labyrinth Daedalus constructed for King Minos. It served as a prison. Purportedly located on the island of Crete in the city of Knossos, the maze was built to incarcerate the Minotaur, a creature born from an illicit encounter between the queen and a bull. As most schoolchildren learn, this monster devoured more than a dozen Athenian youths every few years before Theseus eventually slew it. Note 123. At the risk of stating the obvious, no woman can mate with a bull and produce a child. Recognizing this simple scientific fact, I am led to a somewhat interesting suspicion. King Minos did not build the labyrinth to imprison a monster, but to conceal a deformed child. His child. While the Minotaur has often been depicted as a creature with the body of a bull, but the torso of a man, centaur-like, the myth describes the Minotaur as simply having the head of a bull and the body of a man. Note 127. W. H. Matthews writes, a similar small labyrinth with a central Theseus Minotaur design is to be found on the wall of the church of San Michele Maggiore at Pavia. It is thought to be of 10th century construction. This is one of the few cases where the Minotaur is represented with a human head and a beast's body, as a sort of centaur, in fact. See his book, Mazes and Labyrinths, Their History and Development, New York, Dover Publications, Incorporated, 1970, page 56. Also see Figure 40 on page 53. End note 127. Or, in other words, a man with a deformed face. I believe pride would not allow Minos to accept that the heir to the throne had a horrendous appearance. Consequently, he dissolved the right of ascension by publicly accusing his wife Pasiphae of fornicating with the male bovine. Having enough conscience to keep from murdering his own flesh and blood, Minos had a labyrinth constructed, complicated enough to keep his son from ever escaping, but without bars to suggest a prison. It is interesting to note how the myth states most of the Athenian youth fed to the Minotaur actually starved to death in the labyrinth, thus indicating their deaths had more to do with the complexity of the maze and less to do with the presumed ferocity of the Minotaur. I am convinced Minos' maze really serves as a trope for repression. My published thoughts on this subject: see Birth Defects in Knossos, Sunny Won't Wait Flyer, Santa Cruz, 1968. Note 124. Violent Prejudice in Knossos by Zampano in Sunny Will Wait Flyer, Santa Cruz, 1969. End struck through text. Note 125. I've no idea why these titles and cited sources are different. It seems much too deliberate to be an error. But since I haven't been able to find the flyer, I don't know for certain. I did call Ashley back, left message, even though I still don't remember her. End note 125. End note 124. Resumption of struck through text in note 123. Inspired the playwright Taggart Chicklitz to author a play called The Minotaur for the Seattle Repertory Company. Note 126. The Minotaur by Taggart Chicklitz, put on at the Jesus Theatre by the Seattle Repertory Company on April 14th, 1972. End note 126. As only 8 people, including the doorman, got a chance to see the production, I produce here a brief summary. Chicklitz begins his play with Minos entering the labyrinth late one evening to speak to his son. As it turns out, the Minotaur is a gentle and misunderstood creature, while the so-called Athenian youth are convicted criminals who were already sentenced to death back in Greece. Usually, King Minos has them secretly executed, and then publicly claims their deaths were caused by the terrifying Minotaur, thus ensuring that the residents of Knossos will never get too close to the labyrinth. Unfortunately, this time, one of the criminals had escaped into the maze, encountered Mint, as Chicklitz refers to the Minotaur, and nearly murdered him. Had Minos himself not rushed in and killed the criminal, his son would have perished. Paragraph break. Suffice it to say, Minos is furious. He has caught himself caring for his son, and the resulting guilt and sorrow incenses him to no end. Paragraph break. As the play progresses, the king slowly sees past his son's deformities, eventually discovering an elegiac spirit, an artistic sentiment, and most importantly, a visionary understanding of the world. Soon a deep paternal love grows in the king's heart, and he begins to conceive of a way to reintroduce the Minotaur back into society. Paragraph break. Sadly, the stories the king has spread throughout the world concerning this terrifying beast prove the seeds of tragedy. Soon enough, a bruiser named Theseus arrives. Chiclets describes him as a drunken, virtually retarded frat boy who, without a second thought, hacks the Minotaur into little pieces. Paragraph break. In one of the play's most moving scenes, King Minos, with tears streaming down his face, publicly commends Theseus's courage. The crowd believes the tears are a sign of gratitude, while we, the audience, understand they are tears of loss. The king's heart breaks, and while he will go on to be an extremely just ruler, it is a justice forever informed by the deepest kind of agony. Note 128. Even in Metamorphoses, Ovid notes how Minos, in his old age, feared young men. Qui, dum fuit integer aevi, terruerat magnas ipso quoque nomine gentes, tunc erat invalidus. Deonidenque invente robore militum forboque parente superbum. Pertimuit credensque suis insurgere regnis, haud tamen est patris arcere penatibus ausus. When Minos was in golden middle age, all nations feared the mention of his name, but now he'd grown so impotent, so feeble, he shied away from proud young Meletus, the forward son of Phoebus and Dione. Though Minos half suspected Meletus, had eyes upon his throne, and framed a plot to make a palace revolution, he feared to act, to sign the papers for his deportation. Horace Gregory, pages 258-9. Perhaps Meletus reminded Minos of his slain son, and, out of guilt, he cowered in the presence of his youth. End note 128. End note 123. End of struck through text. However, even as Holloway Roberts, Jed Leader, and Wax Hook make their way further down the stairway in exploration number 4, the purpose of that vast place still continues to elude them. Is it merely an aberration of physics, some kind of warp in space, or just a topiary labyrinth on a much grander scale? Perhaps it serves a funereal purpose, conceals a secret, protects something, imprisons or hides some kind of monster, or, for that matter, imprisons or hides an innocent. As the Holloway team soon discovers, answers to these questions are not exactly forthcoming. Note 129, previously read. Penelope Reed Doob avoids the tangled discussion of purpose by cleverly drawing a distinction between those who walk within a labyrinth and those who stand outside of it. Maze treaders, whose vision ahead and behind is severely constricted and fragmented, suffer confusion, whereas maze viewers, who see the pattern whole from above or in a diagram, are dazzled by its complex artistry. What you see depends on where you stand, and thus, at one and the same time, labyrinths are single, there is one physical structure, and double. They simultaneously incorporate order and disorder, clarity and confusion, unity and multiplicity, artistry and chaos. They may be perceived as a path, a linear but circuitous passage to a goal, or as a pattern, a complete symmetrical design. Our perception of labyrinths is thus intrinsically unstable. Change your perspective, and the labyrinth seems to change. Note 134, previously read. Unfortunately, the dichotomy between those who participate inside and those who view from the outside breaks down when considering the house, simply because no one ever sees that labyrinth in its entirety. Therefore, comprehension of its intricacies must always be derived from within. This not only applies to the house, but to the film itself. From the outset of the Navidson record, we are involved in a labyrinth. meandering from one celluloid cell to the next, trying to peek around the next edit in hopes of finding a solution, a center, a sense of whole, only to discover another sequence, leading in a completely different direction, a continually devolving discourse promising the possibility of discovery, while, all along, dissolving into chaotic ambiguities too blurry to ever completely comprehend. Note 135. Previously read. In order to fully appreciate the way the ambages unwind, twist only to rewind, and then open up again, whether in Navidson's house or the film, quae itinerum ambages occurrusque ac recursus inexplicabilis. Note 136. Passages that wind, advance, and retreat in a bewilderingly intricate manner. Editors. Pliny also wrote when describing the Egyptian maze, sed crebis foribus inditis ad felendos cursus rediundunque in errores eustem. Doors are let into walls at frequent intervals to suggest deceptively the way ahead and to force the visitor to go back upon the very same tracks that he has already followed in his wanderings. Editors. Note K. Currently being read. End note 136. We should look to the etymological inheritance of a word like labyrinth. The Latin labor is akin to the root labi, meaning to slip or slide backwards. Note 137, previously read. Though the commonly perceived meaning suggests difficulty and work. Implicit in labyrinth is a required effort to keep from slipping or falling, in other words, stopping. We cannot relax within those walls, we have to struggle past them. Hugh of St. Victor has gone so far as to suggest that the antithesis of labyrinth, that which contains work, is Noah's Ark. Note 138. See Chapter 6, footnote 82, Tom's story, as well as footnote 249, editors, end note 138. In other words, that which contains rest. Note X, previously read.